All right, here we go. Welcome everyone to another lesson for Como-Pickton's U.S. History dual credit class with Northeast Texas Community College. This is History 1301, and today we're going to talk about Chapter 4, Colonization and Conflict in the North. Okay, so last week we talked about colonization in the southern colonies, so basically Maryland, Virginia, all the way down to Georgia. And today we're going to be talking about the northern colonies. And so a lot of what we're going to learn about this week is in parallel with what happened in Chapter 3. So Chapter 3 and Chapter 4 are not sequential, rather they're parallel, and they take a geographic division of what's happening in the history. So first thing we're going to talk about is about France and their colonies. We'll talk about the founding of New England, the Puritans in Massachusetts, the early New England stability, the development of the mid-Atlantic colonies, and then their adjustments to being part of the British Empire. So first thing we're going to talk about is the French. The French have a totally different style of colonization compared to Spain and England. So Spain, they went in conquerors. They went into just about every place that they interacted with, and they completely and totally just conquered stuff. They went in and they would, take over civilizations, enslave people, turn ancient American societies into their little corner of the world as an empire. England, they tried to replicate England in America. So the English colonists, they would come in and try to turn the forests and fields and marshes of Virginia and later Massachusetts, and they tried to transform those areas into something that looked like England back home. Okay, in fact, New England becomes virtually a new version of England. But the French are different, and probably the French do it in a way that is the most friendly to Native Americans. The French claim large portions of North America, and they claim it as theirs. But in practice, the French respect more Native American boundaries and Native American culture and Native American tribes better than most of the English and the Spanish and other colonizers. So, what do the French end up colonizing? They basically gain a claim to the Mississippi River from Louisiana and their settlement New Orleans. And they also claim the northern part of what is today Canada, specifically the areas of Quebec leading into the Great Lakes regions. Okay, so some of the earliest explorers of the French are people like Cartier and Champlain. Okay, so these are French explorers, and they travel all across what will become Canada, okay? Samuel de Champlain and Jacques Cartier, they end up sailing through different parts of Canada. Cartier is first in 1535, but in 1605, the French plant a permanent colony at Port Royal in Acadia, which is present-day Nova Scotia. 3 years later, Samuel de Champlain established Quebec farther up the St. Lawrence River. So the French are kind of exploring in the north through waterways. If you look at the geography, they are moving further and further west through bays and rivers, and they get access to the Great Lakes. Now, when the French establish settlements, they're not like the English who are constantly trying to farm and gain more land. And they're not like the Spanish who are going around conquering native peoples and turning them into slaves. Rather, what the French do is they establish friendly relationships with large numbers of different types of Indians, okay? They trade goods back and forth with them, and this provides a really friendly relationship between the French and the Indians. Now, the French colonies never have the same amount of population as the Spanish or the English do. They have a few cities like Quebec and later on New Orleans that have a lot of people in them, but they're not these sprawling massive colonies like you'll see in Virginia and New England or in New Spain back in Mexico, okay? The French, they actually have more of a business opportunity. You see, the French, they don't really care about getting the land, but they care about the things that the land can provide, okay? One of those things is fur, okay? The French cultivate trading relationships with Native Americans by trading them things that the Native Americans can't make themselves, things like iron kettles, metal tools, metal knives, things to help them start fires, okay? For Native Americans, the convenience of having an iron kettle to boil water is really wonderful. It's an amazing opportunity for them. And many Native Americans are happy to trade things like furs and, goods that they can harvest better than the French can in exchange for those goods, okay? Instead of having to carry around smoldering coals to start fire, having a flint that you can start a spark of fire all by yourself anywhere you are is a game changer for many Native Americans. And so a lot of Native Americans in that area of what becomes Canada are very friendly to the French in order to get the items that they can't acquire otherwise, okay? Now, the French developed strong alliances with certain types of Indians, and perhaps the most important of the ones that they ally with are the Algonquins, the Montagnais, and the Hurons, okay? So early on, when Champlain founded his settlement, these Indians wanted to know that he would be a good friend to them, okay? And so there's a story of Champlain going on to fight the Mohawks, and he brought a gun. And in the battle, as the battle began, there was a small skirmish, and he pulls out his gun, shoots dead 2 Mohawk chiefs, and all of a sudden, all the other Mohawk Indians, they'd never seen a gun before. They freaked out, and the allies of the French go on to win the battle. After this point, the Indians want guns, but the French are reluctant to trade them guns. They don't want to. They want to hold that balance of technological power over the Indians. You see, the French still want to dominate the Indians, like the English and the Spanish, but rather than go about trying to take their land, the French want the Indians to work for them and pursue their interest. And what they want is fur, okay? European goods would be traded for tens of thousands of otter, raccoon, and most especially beaver pelts, okay? Now, the furs that were available in North America were prized in Europe for things like fashionable hats and things like the robes of European officials and churchmen, okay? A lot of beavers died to make hats, okay? And today, still, people make hats out of beaver fur. It's apparently a great way to make a hat. Okay, and so really fancy, you might see a really fancy cowboy hat that might be hundreds of dollars, and you're like, why does this cost hundreds of dollars? And then you realize it's made out of beaver, okay? But anyways, the Europeans, they love beaver hats, and so the Native Americans start hunting beaver and hunting other animals, killing them and selling them to the French in exchange for European-made goods, okay? Now, what happens as a result of this is that the French start establishing little settlements further down the river system of North America. And the French set up lots of outposts in places like modern day, eventually we talk about modern day Ohio, but along the Mississippi River and around the Great Lakes, the French have lots of little fortresses. And these fortresses are places for them to basically trade back and forth with the Indians and have a safe place. But New France, as it becomes known, does not become a new version of France. Rather, there's a very small number of French people living in this area trading with Native Americans. Now, this fur trade leads to the depopulation of a lot of animals in North America as Indians start hunting them more and more exclusively to sell to Europeans. It disrupts the balance of power between different Native Americans, as some Native American groups get aid from the French, and they use that to dominate others and to hunt their lands to get their beavers to sell to the Europeans. Okay? Now, some of these French colonists that come to New France, you see a lot of young men and boys that move to Canada, and they began to work and live side by side with certain Native American groups. They become known as coureurs des bois, or runners in the woods. They become super familiar with Native American languages and Native American customs. And the French build really strong relationships with Indians across the Americas. And they send out missionaries, okay? So the Jesuits are they're a religious group within the Catholic Church, and they are kind of like the Franciscans, but they don't do the same, they have some differences within their orders. But one thing that the Jesuits do is they're very focused on proselytizing and converting Indians. And the Jesuits move out and they settle in, they start moving to New France, and they start settling and living within different tribes, performing a role as kind of like a diplomat and a missionary at the same time. And the French provide better trade deals to Indians who convert to Catholicism. And so the Jesuits have a lot of success getting Native Americans in the area to become Catholics, okay? So over time, we see more and more Native Americans taking up religion of the Catholics in France, but there is some conflict and quarrels within there. All right, so the French, they make some good relationships with the Indians, okay? Now, the French, their most immediate enemy in this enterprise is actually not the English, it's the Dutch. New Amsterdam is what is today New York. And the Dutch build up a fort on modern-day Manhattan called Fort Orange, okay? Now, Fort Orange I believe, is in modern-day Manhattan, and they're led by the Dutch. And the Dutch are very different from the French, okay? So the French are largely Catholic. There is a group of Protestants within France called the Huguenots, but mostly the French in the Americas are Catholic. The Dutch are Calvinists, okay? And they are Protestants, and they do not get along with the French. And both of them are wanting to trade with Native Americans for beaver furs and things like that. And this leads to something called the Beaver Wars. And the big question mark in all this is a very powerful group of Native Americans called the Iroquois. Okay, the Iroquois were a confederation of 5 tribes in what is modern-day New York and the Great Lakes area, okay? And the Iroquois are caught in between the French and the Dutch. And the French and the Dutch both want Native Americans on their side. And as they start, pressuring Native Americans to hunt more and more beavers, the beaver population in that area collapses as they become depopulated. Okay, and so the main ally of the French are the Huron Indians, okay? Whereas the Dutch are relying a lot on the Iroquois, okay? And specifically the group called the Mohawks, which are one of the most powerful groups, okay? Now, the Mohawks and the Iroquois, they trade with the Dutch. And the Hurons and they're called the Algonquins. The Hurons, the Algonquins, and the Montagnais, and I may be mispronouncing that, they're kind of on the side of the French, okay? Now, the Iroquois, they have access to the tools and weapons that had kept them behind. You see, the Iroquois had been losing because the French were giving their enemies stuff, but now they have the Dutch on their side, and so they start fighting back and forth between each other, okay? And so there starts to be almost all-out war between the Hurons and the Mohawks and their allies like the Iroquois and others. But just as this war really starts taking off, and it's like an all-out war with the Dutch and their Indians versus the French and their Indians, a wave of smallpox goes through all across the French, the Indians allied with the French, okay? Champlain, he dies of a stroke, and then waves of smallpox afflict the settlements in the Northeast in the 1630s. And just like other stories that we've seen, these virgin soil epidemics where these Indians are not exposed to European diseases, they don't have a lot of natural immunity, it just devastates the Native American groups, especially the Hurons, okay? So, we see more than 10,000 Hurons die between 1634 and 1640, reducing their total population by half. And then as a result, a lot of Hurons convert to Catholicism, kind of perhaps out of fear or out of desire to be more friendly with the French as things become more desperate, okay? And what you end up seeing is an increase in war as a result of this, okay? The Iroquois also suffered, okay? But the Iroquois, when they suffered from the epidemics, they went out to kidnap people. And that's something that occurs with this particular group of Native Americans, and other groups of Native Americans do this too. There is this practice among a lot of Native American groups of kidnapping people to replace people that die, okay? So if you are a Native American and your son dies of disease or dies in a battle, it is normal to go on like a raid and kidnap a baby boy and bring it back to your tribe and raise it as a replacement for your old son that was dead. Okay, this sort of thing happened. And so as Mohawks and other Iroquois are dying from the disease, they are motivated to go and attack other tribes and kidnap members of their tribes to replace their lost population. This later on leads to some of the worst conflicts between the English and Native Americans. You see, Native American tribes do this practice of kidnapping people to replace people that they lose. And that becomes like one of the biggest nightmares for English colonists, the idea of being captured and being carried off and turned into an Indian. And this actually happens to quite a few people, especially young kids. Now, adults would be captured, but they typically would hold on to their old culture. But kids, they are very, very malleable, and you can take a kid and raise it a different way. You can take a kid from a totally different culture from you. You could go off to some faraway country in Asia or in Africa or in Europe or whatever, and take them as an infant to America, raise them up as an American, and you really couldn't tell the difference, based off of their personality and the way that they act, okay? This happened to English colonists, and it was a fear, okay? And you also factor in the religious fear as well, okay? If you're a Christian and you have a child, you want your child to grow up to be a Christian so they can go to heaven. And then if your kid gets kidnapped by Indians and they go off and they worship Indian religion, then that is terrifying, okay? So this practice that Native Americans do is kind of a factor in a lot of the conflicts between Native Americans and Europeans, because whenever people get kidnapped, they try to rescue them. And this leads to more and more fighting. And as Native Americans get killed in the fighting with Europeans, they have more motivation to go kidnap more people. And so sometimes we have a cycle that just gets worse and worse. Anyways, for the Hurons themselves, they start to collapse, okay? Hurons start very quickly flocking to become Catholics. They start being forced to abandon their land and their towns as the Iroquois expand into their territory. And before it's over, the Hurons basically collapse as a people. And a lot of them get integrated into the Iroquoian society. The Iroquois, they expand, they take the scraps and they sort of assimilate them into the Iroquois people. Okay, and the Iroquois, they become basically the most powerful group of Native Americans in what becomes like New England, okay? And they remain the most powerful group until after the French and Indian Wars, okay, which we should talk about later on this semester, okay? The Iroquois, then they start to move against groups like the Delaware and the Shawnee in the Ohio Valley. They start attacking the Algonquins in Canada and the Abenakis and others in New England, and they just become more and more powerful. But around this time, and this kind of happens in parallel, the Dutch get kicked out of New York and the English eventually take over. And the Iroquois, they end up siding, they split, but the Iroquois, some of them end up becoming friends with the French, and it just becomes kind of complicated. But the Beaver Wars were a big deal for Native American communities in the northern part of what becomes the United States. Now, after the Hurons are defeated, the French want to find new Native American allies, and like we talked about before, they start moving further and further south. They start They start trying to bring together their new partners in the fur trade, and they start moving out into the western Great Lakes. So they move away from the Iroquois dominated land, kind of east of the Great Lakes. Really, if you think like upstate New York, like that's like the center of the Iroquois. Okay, so they start moving off to the west, and they start accessing the Mississippi River. They start settling along the Mississippi River, and they create different settlements, and they end up getting to New Orleans. And we see a French explorer named La Salle. He explores the Mississippi, and La Salle is actually important for Texas history because La Salle set up a fort in modern day Texas. Okay, now our book does not tell the full story of La Salle, but Sieur de, excuse me, Rene Robert Cavalier, Sieur de La Salle, a big long name. He was the first European to descend the river to the Gulf Coast in 1682. He encountered lots of Native Americans who had not seen Europeans since De Soto, the Spanish guy, had went through that area 150 years before. Okay, so following him were more French forts and settlements and trading posts. But La Salle actually he ends up dying in Texas, okay? He settles in Texas and sets up a fort, and things go bad. He ends up being killed, I believe, by his own men. You can look up that story. It's fascinating. But that is part of the reason why Texas has 6 flags in our history, okay? So if you've ever been to Six Flags, it's named Six Flags because Texas has had 6 flags, okay? Texas has been claimed by Spain. It's been claimed by France, okay? So we already talked about Spain, Cabeza de Vaca. France, La Salle actually settles a little fort in Texas, sticks a flag up and says, Texas is part of France now. It doesn't last, and the Spanish regain control. Then Texas becomes part of Mexico when Mexico gets its independence. Then Texas became independent and had the Lone Star flag. Then Texas joined the United States, and then during the Civil War, Texas joined the Confederacy. So the 6 flags of Texas are Spain, France, Mexico, Texas, America, and the Confederacy. Anyway, so that's where that part comes from. But anyways, what you need to know about the French is that they have a successful colonial system that doesn't require a lot of French people, okay? Around 1700, the approximate population of French people in the Americas in New France is 15,000, which is a drop in the bucket compared to the hundreds of thousands of English that are in America by 1700, okay? And it's very small compared to Spain as well. But the difference is the French have much better relationships with Native Americans. And for Native Americans, they preferred the French. Yeah, the French pressured them to convert to Catholicism. Yes, the French, would only give them guns, say if they became a Catholic, only trade with them. They did pressure them and they did try to control them. But it was a lot better than the English and the Spanish, going out of their way to, annihilate them. As far as just what if a Native American back then could pick, they would probably pick the French, okay? So it may have turned out better for them if they went with the English or the Spanish or whatever, but for the most part, you would think just from the perspective of, are we going to get killed and have our land taken away from us? The French are probably the least likely to do so. Okay, now let's talk about the Pilgrims, okay? So if you remember last week, in the week before, we talked about the religious reform in Europe, okay? Europe had been mostly Catholic for hundreds of years, and then there was the Protestant Reformation. England became a Protestant country thanks to King Henry VIII wanting to divorce his wife, and the Pope said no. So the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, which today in America is oftentimes called the Episcopalian Church, was not that much different than the Catholic Church, okay? They changed a few big things, but a lot of the elements of the church, especially a lot of like the things in their ceremonies and just the kind of the words they said and the way they acted, were very reminiscent of the Catholic Church. The Puritans were a group of Calvinist Protestants who wanted to reform the Anglican Church and make it pure. Purify it of all those elements of Catholicism, okay? Now, there were different groups of Puritans, okay? They were not all the same. The Presbyterian churches, Presbyterian Puritans believed in the idea of having a hierarchy of churches. So that's the idea, like that all churches are under the authority of a big church at the top, and then the little churches kind of report up to them. And so you have like bishops over, you know, smaller groups, and they don't call them bishops, I don't think, but they have government within the church that rules over the smaller individual congregations. And then there's the Congregationalists. And Congregationalists believe that each local church should report directly to God. The idea is that, you know, God is in control of all the churches. And so the Congregationalists, they believe that their congregation should conduct its own affairs independently and not answer to a higher authority. Like they shouldn't have to ask for permission from people that are above them in the church. It's like they, you know, there's more of the idea that each individual church is equally independent to each other. Okay. Now, one thing that the Puritans really emphasize is the idea of predestination, that Calvinists believe that God knows everything, he can do everything, he is everywhere. So then, therefore, it makes sense that he knows who is going to get to go to heaven and who is not going to get to go to heaven. This is the idea of predestination. And it has a lot of logic and it makes a lot of sense when you read the Bible, okay? If you look at Romans chapter 1, Ephesians chapter 1, Romans chapter 8, there's a lot of very clear language in the Bible that says that God has decided, or God knows who is saved and who is not. And so the Puritans, they're really, really into this idea, and they oppose another philosophy called Arminianism, which we're not going to get into it too much, but Arminianism believes in the idea of human free will, that humans can decide whether or not they want to get saved. Anyways, but Puritans want to reform the church, okay? And their belief in predestination gives them comfort because it provides their life with meaning and purpose. God picked you for a reason, and you have a life to live for a reason, and you have a purpose from God to do something right and to do what is your role in God's plan for the world. Okay? Now, they believed as a result of this and other beliefs that there needed to be reform in England. Okay? They saw too much wickedness in England. They didn't like the fact that the English church tolerated drunkenness, theater going, gambling, extravagance, swearing, and Sabbath breaking. Sorry about that. We are going to snooze that. Okay, anyways. And they wanted to get rid of all the remnants of Roman Catholicism. Okay? They didn't like the idea that the Church of England basically said, if you're English, you're in our church. Okay, and for the Puritans, they said, no, you can only be in the church if you're saved. You can only get baptized if you're saved, and if you're not a church member. And so they have some difficulties with the English church, and many of them who are Puritans, they want to reform. They stay within the Church of England, and they try to change it from the inside. Okay, so the idea is that they agree to remain members of the Church of England, but they want to push for change from within. But then the most extreme want to separate, and they say the Church of England, we can't fix it. The only way it's going to be fixed is if we leave and start our own church. That way we can follow the Bible the way that we believe it is best. Those people are called the Separatists. Okay? Now, the Separatists, at first, they separate and they move to the Netherlands, okay? They kind of get kicked out because they're annoying people, but, not necessarily that they're annoying, but rather that their constant calls for reform, a lot of people don't like it. And so there's pressure in England to kick them out, okay? Now, the Puritans became outspoken critics of the monarchy as a result of the church. They criticized the church. The king or queen of England, they are the leaders of the church. So their criticisms become interpreted as criticisms of the church, of the monarch. And so James I didn't like it. He wanted to get rid of these, and the Separatists, they end up leaving. Now, the first Separatists, they end up moving to the Netherlands. You see, the Netherlands, the Dutch people, they had religious freedom. And so they allowed the Pilgrims, the early Pilgrims, to move to the Netherlands and worship as they wished. But the Netherlands didn't really like, the Puritans didn't really like being in the Netherlands because they were surrounded by Dutch people, and they were surrounded by people that didn't believe the same way they did. And they feared for their children being corrupted by the Dutch people around them. And so whenever they get the opportunity, they look to America as the hope to be free. That idea of liberty, the liberty to believe and worship as they wish. They look at America as the place to go, and they do, okay? They are given permission from the English government to form a colony called the Massachusetts Bay Company, and they are given permission to, or well, that happens later, but they're given permission to form a colony and settle in the Americas. And their goal is to go to Virginia, okay? The Pilgrims, when they set sail in 1620 and came to the Americas, they end up sailing for Virginia, but they make a mistake and they actually land in Massachusetts. And in November 1620, they are found in a place north of Virginia called New England. And it had been named New England by Captain John Smith. We talked about him last week with, Jamestown, okay, Pocahontas, that story. John Smith had explored and saw like this area is kind of like England, okay? He said this area north of Virginia, it's kind of rocky. It's not as hot. It's got big forests. This is like England back before it was all settled. It's kind of like the imagination. Like this is like a new England without European settlement. Okay. And so they land in New England on accident, but they decide to just try to make it work. Okay. So they end up settling. Now here's the problem though. Okay. They land in November in Massachusetts. And winter is coming soon. There were 88 pilgrims that set anchor in a place they called Plymouth on the coast of present-day southern Massachusetts. Okay, they had been weakened and were sick from scurvy, from malnutrition, and they had been on the ship for a long time. They'd had some arguments on the ship, but they had also lacked a lot of supplies. The early backers were supposed to give them supplies that they did not get, but they decide to continue to make it work. And a lot of people look at the story of the Mayflower and see this as proof of divine intervention, the fact that they survived. By all accounts, when you look at this story on paper, they should have all died, okay? They didn't have food. They landed right before the winter. They were not ready. But somehow, miraculously, they end up surviving. Okay, they managed to struggle their way through the first early difficult winter. Okay, half of the immigrants had died, but they ended up getting a lot of help from Native Americans. They were in fact beneficiaries of a catastrophe. You see, epidemics of disease had wiped out large numbers of Native Americans that lived in Massachusetts. Okay. And overall, the native coastal population was possibly reduced by as much as 90%. There were a lot of abandoned villages, and early visitors were find these piles of dead bodies from this epidemic that had happened right before them. Okay. And so the leader of the Native Americans, that area, the group is called the Wampanoags, and their chief was called Messaswat. Okay. And he agreed to help these starving colonists. Okay. He thought that this would be a great opportunity for possible trade. And since they were already weak from the disease and the epidemics, they thought they could use any help they could get. And so they end up giving a lot of help to the the English colonists of the Pilgrims. Now, quick word on pilgrim. The word pilgrim means someone who goes on a religious journey. A journey to receive religious enlightenment or to get closer to God, etc. And so for the Pilgrims, they believed that moving to the Americas was a way for them to get closer to God, to have freedom to worship God the way they wanted to. And in many ways, going on a pilgrimage is a way to make yourself more reliant on God. Like if you're going on a faraway journey, you're away from your home, you're away from your family, you kind of have to rely on the kindness of strangers and what God provides you. And in this case, you could say that God provided. In fact, God did provide these Mayflower, the inhabitants of the Mayflower ship, the early Plymouth Bay Pilgrims, provided them exactly what they needed in the form of a Native American named Squanto. Okay, Squanto is a very interesting person in history. He is personally responsible for Massachusetts even surviving as a colony. Okay, he had been kidnapped by English sailors years before this had happened. Okay, so English sailors had kidnapped him and forced him to be, to work on their ship. And the English are always doing this, kidnapping and impressing people to serve in their navy. And he learned English and eventually was able to return back home to Massachusetts. And so the Pilgrims, they don't speak these Native Americans' languages. They have no way to make friends with them. And somehow, miraculously, God provides them an Indian that can speak English. And he serves as the intermediary to work things out between the Pilgrims. They manage to survive. And then in the spring, once they get through that first brutal winter, in the spring, Squanto and other friendly Native Americans show the Pilgrims how to grow corn, how to build their settlements, how to survive. And in 1621, at harvest, unlike the last year, 1620, they were starving. By 1621, the Pilgrims have full inventories of food to last the winter. They have shelters, and they celebrate in what becomes the first Thanksgiving, where they give thanks to God for providing them a way to survive, providing them food, providing them knowledge, providing them a friend like Squanto, and friendly relations with the Native Americans. And they invite Native Americans to that feast, and they get together and they have a large feast that becomes the very first Thanksgiving, a tradition that we still keep in America today. At harvest time, we take time, and you probably remember Thanksgiving. You've probably experienced Thanksgiving in America. We get together with our families, we eat food, and you give thanks, particularly to God, for providing for you for that year. That's the idea of Thanksgiving, and it goes back to the Pilgrims, who almost all died. And then miraculously, they had provision to survive the next year. One last thing we want to talk about on this slide is the Mayflower Compact, okay? This is a framework for government that is an early influencer on what becomes the American Constitution. When the Pilgrims were still on the boat, before they got off the Mayflower, they took time to draw up a plan for how they would govern themselves, okay? Now, in the eyes of English law, technically, there was no basis for them having a law different from English law. But they realized that they didn't have a royal charter, they didn't have approval from the crown at first, but the English authorities were distracted by problems at home. And so they decided to form their own government to organize and to monitor the whole system. They needed a government. They needed rules. They needed laws. They weren't going to get one from England, so they make one themselves, okay? What ends up happening is they actually get sort of a representative assembly started where the people who vote are church members, and it actually is a very workable system, and it works, and it's copied by other settlements of Puritans that then come to Massachusetts afterwards, okay? Now, the Massachusetts turns out to be a way better place as far as setting up a family than Virginia in some ways. You can't make as much money in Virginia, okay? Massachusetts is not a place where you can grow tobacco. There's not gold, okay? There's no super profitable way to set up cash crops and plantations in Virginia. But what you can do in Virginia or in Massachusetts doesn't have this way to get rich quick. But it does have a favorable climate for subsistence agriculture. So subsistence agriculture is when people grow food to survive. They grow enough food to provide for their families. And so the Pilgrims in Massachusetts are able to grow corn, they're able to grow gourds, they're able to grow, beans, they're able to raise cattle, they're able to raise chickens, they're able to have pigs, they're able to chop down forests to build houses and to build ships and things like that. And so they're able to survive on their own independently from England. In Virginia, that colony was very much export focused. They grew tobacco to sell to England to make cash. And people came to Virginia not necessarily wanting to have a new home, but rather to make money. And so that's why people in Virginia, they tended to be more men that moved to Virginia, and there was all these indentured servants that went to Virginia just to get rich quick. But in Massachusetts, you don't move to Massachusetts to become rich. You move to Massachusetts to become a simple farmer, living with your family, making a home for yourself, building your own farms, building your own house. You're not going to be rich, but your basic needs are going to be provided for through your own hard work. And for many Puritans, this was very appealing because they could move to Virginia and have their own communities. They could worship the way they wanted to, and they could live life the way that they thought best honored God. You know, just dutifully working, living their little corner of the world, raising their children, and having a happy life. That's like the idea. And so Massachusetts had a lot more families, okay? There's a larger number of women that moved to Massachusetts than in Virginia. This leads to a stable society that actually has natural population growth, not just immigrants moving in, but having children and having their children have children and their children have children. And we see successful families become established in Massachusetts that are still, thriving even today. Something, okay, like, I don't have an example offhand, but these develop very long-lasting, traditional, families that survive for a very long period of time and create this culture of New England, okay? Now, after the Pilgrims survive, like the first wave of just danger, they start telling people how great it is, okay? New England is not as hot or as mosquito-y or as full of malaria as Virginia is. The soil is rocky, it's lots of forest, you can grow tobacco in it, but it's a great place to plow up an acre of corn, have some cows and some chickens. And so there's a second wave of Puritan migration to New England, and we start to see the formal Massachusetts Bay Company be filled. I kind of messed up earlier in the lesson. The first group of Pilgrims, they just kind of went and did it. They didn't really plan, okay? But once more people start going to Massachusetts, we see the Massachusetts Bay Company be kind of authorized by England. And for people in England, they love this idea. They're like, let's take all these crazy Puritans who are bothering us, telling us how we need to reform. Let's just go let them go to America. They can go do whatever they want, and they'll leave us alone. Okay? One of the most famous early settlers in Massachusetts is a guy named John Winthrop. Okay, John Winthrop becomes the leader of a church in Massachusetts, okay, and they start establishing the town of Salem, which is north of Plymouth, okay, and the first company governor is John Winthrop, but he's also a pastor. And so in Virginia, there are churches, but they're not as powerful. But in Massachusetts, the church is both the center of religious worship, but it's also the center of politics in Massachusetts. If you want to vote in the colony's business, in the assembly, you have to be a church member. And John Winthrop is both the governor and he's the pastor of the church in Salem. But he has a vision. He has a vision for what Massachusetts can be. He preaches a sermon called The City on a Hill. And it's based off of a passage in the Sermon on the Mount of Jesus. When Jesus, in the book of Matthew, he preaches and he tells people how he tells his followers that they're the light of the world, okay? You may hear, there's a Christian song like, "This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine." The idea is that Christians should be a light shining for God, and that people who see Christians should see God in them, and that should lead them to come to the Lord for salvation, ask for forgiveness of their sins, and get to go to heaven, okay? And Jesus says in that sermon that a city that is on a hill cannot be hid. Everyone looks up at a city on the hill and they see what it's doing, they see what it represents, and he's basically telling his followers, Jesus told his disciples and his followers, that they're going to be on watch, and people are going to see what they do, and they're going to think about God based off of what they see in them. Okay, so if you see good Christians doing good things, that's going to inspire people to get closer to God. That's the idea. And that if they're doing bad things, then that might make some people think that they should not. Okay. And so what John Winthrop says is that Massachusetts is a city on a hill. Okay. The whole world is watching us to see if we can do this, to see if we can live holy, good lives for the Lord here, to have liberty to believe what we want to believe and do what we want to do. Okay. And so he basically calls on the people of Massachusetts to serve with him in serving the Lord and following in his ideals. Okay. And it's effective. John Winthrop is a very, very long-lasting leader in Massachusetts, very influential. Okay. The colony starts transforming their government. They start creating they have a governor who has assistants. Their charter has annual elections for the governor and his assistants by company stockholders. But over time, that's expanded to every adult male church member. Okay. And the colony is the court that the colony creates ends up establishing laws, levying taxes, having court, making war and peace. Okay. And the whole body of freemen meet and they elect deputies or representatives to the general court. And then we start to see the beginning of a lower house and upper house legislature. By the middle of the 1600s, they've got a full working government that is very similar to the government that we have in the United States today. They have a full-on democracy, and you can look at all the details in the textbook. But what we see after this is a large number of immigrants coming to the Americas from England, specifically to Massachusetts. Okay, there's 21,000 immigrants that come between 1630 and 1642. Okay, and this rapidly colonizes the area. And the Puritans established, and a lot of this is partially because they're able to be so successful because the disease is like wiped out large portions of Native Americans. And so a lot of the land, there are stories of Puritans like finding these open fields that are just perfect for having farms and there's nobody there. It's because they all died. All those Indians had died. And so a lot of the Puritans just kind of move in and set up shop. And you see this rapidly colonized area. But then after 1642, the colony's immigrants start to slow down and their population grows naturally as they start having children, okay? And New England is a better place to live as far as just having children and having a stable life than Virginia. You're going to make more money in Virginia, but if you just want to like have a happy life, have a house and 10 kids and a farm, New England's the place to go. And yes, I said 10 kids, okay? They're making a lot of babies, okay? They're having a healthy farm with lots of food, no TV, okay? They're having kids, okay? So you typically see the average age of someone in the colony to be about 70, which is nearly twice as long as Virginians and 10 years longer than men and women living in England, okay? New England is actually a better place to live than England, old England, okay? And so the New Englanders are living long lives, okay? We see that 90% of children are reaching adulthood, okay? And the typical family consisted of 7 or 8 children who came to maturity. And because of the low death rates and high birth rates, the number of New Englanders doubled about every 27 years, okay? Meanwhile, Europe and the Chesapeake are just Europe is not able to do that. Okay, there's not enough resources in Europe for the population to double every 27 years, but New England is, okay? Now, the New Englanders, they are Puritans, and they really value stability and order, okay? They see God as a stable and orderly God who has commanded his followers to live stable and orderly lives, to be productive, and to do good things. And so their society is very stable and orderly. Their villages are built up in a way that the people live close together while their farms are kind of radiating out in a circle around the village. And so they each have their own farms, but where they live, they have a lot of interaction with each other. Unlike Virginia, where they have these massive, 50-acre plantations and everyone's so spread out, there's not a lot of community. In New England, you may have a 10-acre farm, but your house is within walking distance to your neighbors, okay? And so you imagine a circle or a pizza, you have slices. At the edge, they're wider, but at the center, they all come together at a point. So you have the houses in the middle of the circle and the farms on the outside, okay? And they all get together frequently to go to church. And church membership and the idea of just church is central to their lives, okay? These have strong family institutions that are paternalistic, okay? Pretty soon you start to see people who have parents and grandparents living in New England that are born in New England, okay? Unlike Virginia, where everybody's kind of a newcomer, everybody grew up in England and moved to Virginia to start their plantations. In New England, in Massachusetts, you may be born in Massachusetts and your dad was born in Massachusetts and your grandpa was an immigrant, okay? And so this creates a lot more stability. It allows for the societies to have more traditions. You have like the wisdom of elders, like leading people. You see better decisions being made, and there is a hierarchy in that society where elders and the older men in the society are kind of leading the town and offer advice. But there still is democracy as the people in the church get to vote on decisions for the city government, okay? So things are going well in New England, okay? These are very conservative people. They're very religiously devoted, but there is still some room for conflict. So this is there's a map in your textbook of where they go. This is kind of like, you see the farms, like, it's blurry here, but if you look in your textbook, you'll see a map that'll show you like how the villages are together and then, their farms are spread apart. Anyways, there's some pictures of the meeting houses. But here's the thing. The Puritans did not have religious liberty or religious freedom the way that we think of it today. Today, when we say the word religious freedom, that means you get the freedom to believe whatever you want. Okay, in America, the First Amendment gives you the right to exercise your religion. You can do whatever you want, okay? You worship whatever you want. The law is not going to get upset unless your act of worship is something that is like, if your religion says to go kill people, then we kind of got a problem. But for the most part, we don't care. You can do whatever you want. But in New England, religious freedom meant the freedom to be a Puritan. Okay, because in England, you weren't really allowed to be a full-on Puritan. Well, now in New England, you have the freedom to be a Puritan. You do not have the freedom to be a Catholic. You most certainly do not have the freedom to be like a Muslim or Hindu or whatever. That's like beyond the pale. But you don't even have the freedom to be a slightly different flavor of Puritan, okay? And religious differences that don't seem that big of a deal actually, to us today, like, differences in beliefs about baptism or differences in beliefs about like one particular passage of scripture, which today you might say, okay, well, let's just agree to disagree. Like, this was like extreme problems in New England, okay? And so this actually leads to the settlement of different colonies, okay? So Massachusetts is very strictly Congregationalist Puritans, okay? But many people disagreed about how to best carry out the teachings of the Bible. Like, most of these people are all still Calvinists, and most of these people are all very similar, but like their individual differences get into some problems. So Thomas Hooker in 1636 was the minister at Cambridge, Massachusetts, and he ended up getting into an argument about his beliefs, okay? So he was a little bit more liberal than other Bay Puritans, okay? He wanted to expand the ability to vote in colony elections beyond just church members. And so anyways, he got into an argument. He just had a few differences. He was more lenient and a little more liberal, not like super liberal, but just a little bit more. And so he ended up moving part of his congregation to Connecticut and forming the Connecticut colony in New Haven, okay, which became he created a colony that was Connecticut, which was different. And then New Haven, which was a separate colony, merges with Connecticut in 1662 to become the Connecticut colony, all right? Roger Williams is a very interesting guy. He founded Rhode Island. He is also the guy who founded the first Baptist church in America. You see, Roger Williams believed in freedom of religion. Okay, he believed that everyone should have the right to decide what the religion is, and that if you're forced to take a religion, then it's really not authentic. Okay, so for Roger Williams, the idea is like, if Christianity is right, then people are going to agree to follow Christianity without necessarily being forced to be a Christian or forced to be a certain type of Christian. And that's actually a policy or sort of a belief that has existed among Baptists before any of this happened. The interesting thing about the Baptist church is that while the modern day Baptist church is really kind of a combination of a few different denominations. There are Baptists that existed before the Protestant Reformation. They were called Anabaptists. And there's still some people who call themselves Anabaptists today, but they're different now. But the whole idea of an Anabaptist or a Baptist is that they believe that children should not be baptized, okay? So during the time when the Catholic Church dominated Europe, before Martin Luther started, writing his 95 Theses and starting the Protestant Reformation, there have been Anabaptists who were not Catholics that existed during the time when Catholicism dominated, okay? And they believed that adults should be baptized. You see, a baby, if you've probably ever seen a baby before, it doesn't talk. It probably doesn't have the mental capacity to decide what religion it wants to follow, okay? So Anabaptists say that baptizing a baby is nothing more than dunking a baby's head in water. Like, it doesn't mean anything because the baby can't make a choice. So Baptists believe that adults, or rather people who are old enough to understand, they get to the age of accountability. So that may not be an adult, it may be like 12 or whatever. It's different for each person. But Baptists believe that when a person understands enough to decide, that's when they can get baptized. Because if they're a baby, then it doesn't matter. Now, that doesn't seem like a super big deal, but Baptists would get killed because of this, okay? The Catholic Church and later groups of Protestants like the Lutherans and even some Calvinists, they would kill Anabaptists, okay? Anabaptists or Baptists had the luxury of being hated by everyone because other places believe that if you don't baptize a baby, then what if the baby dies? It's going to go to hell, okay? And so they hated the idea that the Anabaptists wanted people to get baptized as adults, and they would kill Baptists for this. And this happened throughout European history. Large groups of Anabaptists, they would have to hide. They would have to live in hiding because everybody tried to kill them, not just Catholics, but like Lutherans and Calvinists would try to kill Baptists all the time. Anyways, because of that history of being hated by like everyone, Baptists have kind of taken the view of being for religious freedom and for tolerance, okay? And so Roger Williams, he founded Rhode Island and created the first colony with real religious freedom, But I think it was only for Christians. But Roger Williams decided basically, and you can look it up, I think it may have been more than that, but Roger Williams, he believed in full religious toleration. Okay, he believed that the church and the state should be separate. He thought that the church should do church things, the government should do government things, and you can be a Christian in the government, okay, and they can interact with each other, but the church and the state should be somewhat separate so that there can be true religious freedom, okay? And because of those ideas, people in Massachusetts hated him. They kicked him out. He moved to Rhode Island. He starts the first Baptist church, but he doesn't make people become Baptists. Rhode Island does not become the Baptist colony where only Baptists can live. Rather, anybody can move to Rhode Island and believe what they want, okay? And Roger Williams, later on, he kind of moves away from some of the Baptist beliefs, but he is the founder of the first Baptist church in America. So if you are a Baptist, then that's kind of the line that it comes from. And they support religious freedom at this time, and it's a pretty big deal. It's innovative, okay? Anne Hutchinson is probably one of the most interesting of the kind of religious dissidents because she breaks against the more, conservative trends in Massachusetts. Anne Hutchinson starts having some Bible studies at her house, and she starts sharing her ideas, her thoughts. The problem is that she's a woman, okay? And as a woman, okay, she is not supposed to hold a position of authority in the church. Okay, the Puritans are very conservative on this. The only people who hold positions of authority in the church are men. Okay, and women are supposed to be religious and they can have religious opinions, but they're supposed to kind of let their husband speak for them in church. And, within their own homes, they can express their ideas, but in public, they're not supposed to do that. So Anne Hutchinson, just as a woman having religious views, is already a problem to a lot of people in Massachusetts. But then she starts taking controversial positions on doctrine within the Puritan church. And so her disagreements lead to basically her becoming very controversial. Okay. She gets denounced by the ministers in the Bay Colony. She then denounces them, and her followers end up following her. She first settles in Rhode Island, but then she ends up moving elsewhere. Okay. And she gets expelled from the colony. She tries to live in Rhode Island, but then she moves to Long Island, and it's likely that she was going to try to start her own little settlement for her own views, but she dies from an Indian attack in Long Island, which is today part of New York. But basically, her story shows you a little bit about the gender relations in Massachusetts, okay? So there are very defined and strict gender roles in Puritan society, and women are expected to do domestic things, take care of the home, take care of the children, be good mothers, be good wives. And this idea of good wives, there's in fact a book called The Good Wives, which is all about Puritan women. But there is a lot of virtue and honor for these women in this society in being a good wife, okay? Right? Between marriage and middle age, most New England wives were pregnant or breastfeeding. They're raising children. They are working and producing and preparing the food and the clothes that they are eating. Okay. They plant vegetable gardens, prune fruit trees, preserve beef and pork and apple cider, things like that. They milk cows, churn butter. They do all sorts of stuff. And there's a real partnership between men and women in the colony, with men tending to do the things out in the fields, the more heavy lifting labor, but women doing a lot of the work that is absolutely vital, okay? Things like, making clothes, preserving food for the winter, and taking care of the children. This division of labor helps lead to a lot of stability in the society, something that you don't see in Virginia, okay? In Virginia, there's a lot of men just kind of on their own, and if you've ever seen a man on his own, like in a group, it's, men need women, and this idea of like men and women working together in New England is a big reason why New England was so much more stable, why they lived to the age of 70 instead of dying in their 30s and 40s, is partially because of this stability in their society. But not all women want to fit into that role. And if women shirk that role, it's not only, just, oh, she's different. It's like, she's different. Why? What is going on? Why is this person not conforming? And for many people who did not conform, they were accused of working for the devil, okay? So like Anne Hutchinson and like the things that she believed that God had told her, many people said, well, God didn't tell you that. That must have been the devil. And the people in Massachusetts, they believe very strongly in God, and they also believe very strongly in the devil. The devil's in the Bible, demons are in the Bible, demon possession and witchcraft is talked about in the Bible, and these Puritans believe in it. They say that there are people out there that are doing this. There are people that are witches, and their definition of witches is people who worship the devil, and in exchange, the devil gives them, favors or abilities or whatever, okay? So communities sometimes responded to assertive women who kind of buck the trend, with accusations of witchcraft. Now, this is not anything specific to New England, okay? Don't think that this is something that happened in Europe for hundreds of years, okay? Throughout European history, anytime a woman starts doing things that don't fit the mold, there is a big, big risk of them being accused of being a witch and then being burned at the stake or executed, because that's what you do with witches back in these days. You got a witch, you kill them. And, it's great if you can tie them up to a stick and burn them on fire to make sure that you get rid of it, okay? That's what they do, okay? And this is something that was common in Europe, and it happens in America. And the most infamous example is the story of Salem, okay? So Salem, Massachusetts, 1692. This is a weird story, and I wish I had more time. You can look it up. There's a lot of stuff you can learn about the Salem witch trials. But in Salem, there are these two young girls that start reporting to different members in the town that certain people are witches. They start reporting suspicious things they see. And what happens is that we see in the time period of the 1692 Salem witch trials, it's a long, complicated story. But basically, these two young girls, they get into kind of a little bit of trouble, but they realize that if they can blame other people for being witches, they can accuse other people of witches, then that creates paranoia. Okay, so paranoia is when you're like worried about something happening. You don't really have evidence for it, but you're afraid, okay? And the people are paranoid that certain people are witches. How do you know that someone's a witch? They don't have green skin or wear black hats, okay? If they're worshiping the devil in Massachusetts, they're probably doing it in secret. So how do you know if that person that's your neighbor, he may sit next to you in church on Sunday, but when he gets home that night, how do you know he's not, worshiping Satan in his bedroom closet? Okay, you don't know. And so a lot of people get being accused of being a witch, and just the accusation of being a witch is in some cases enough for people to be executed. Because when you're accused of being a witch, how do you defend yourself? How do you say, well, I'm not a witch? They say, well, prove it. Well, you don't see me doing witch things. And like, that's exactly what a witch would say. Okay. All right. A witch would say that they're not a witch. So you must be a witch. Okay. And then people would accuse, well, I'm not a witch. He's a witch. And then, this paranoia starts to eat away at people. Before the Salem witch trials ends, there's about 20 people that get executed for being a witch in Salem, Massachusetts. Okay. Now, in total, 344 New Englanders were charged with witchcraft during the first colonial century. But this one year, having 20 in one spot is like the most infamous. Okay. And there's different people that get accused of being witches that deny it. There's lots of people that are executed. And before it's over, they start accusing people that are in higher and higher positions of power within Salem, Massachusetts. And some people start to think, okay, maybe they're not doing this because they think they're witches. Maybe they're doing this to gain personal advantage. Let's imagine that you have an enemy, someone that is stood in your way of achieving political power within Salem, Massachusetts. Someone that, let's say, oh, they got to be on the city council and not me. Well, if I accuse them of being a witch, they're either going to get executed, which gets rid of them, or their reputation will be so tarnished that no one will ever vote for them again. And then I can do it. Okay. And so there starts to be people that start to make these accusations for likely political reasons. But it gets to the point where it gets so far up that finally people say, okay, enough's enough. And the hysteria kind of ends. But this is probably the biggest example of like the paranoia around witches that happens in Salem, Massachusetts. And this is really an example of, if you are different, if you do not conform to the norms in New England, life's not going to be good for you. So if you're a Puritan and you live in New England, life's great. But if you're different, if you don't fit the norm, it might be dangerous, okay? So Puritans and Indians get along at first, but those relationships start to sour, okay? All right, the Puritans and the English, they share a lot of common ideas, okay? They have a lot, you can read in the textbooks kind of some of the similarities between them. They live agricultural lifestyles. They have similar sort of government structures. But you start to see, they start to see that they have some in common, like their expansion, okay? Both of them want to expand, all right? And the New Englanders end up becoming adversarial with the Indians as they want to expand. So they're not as like voracious as Virginia was with those 50-acre colonies, but the New Englanders want land and they want to take it from other people. Now, not all of New England is taken by force. Like Roger Williams, the guy who founded Rhode Island, he believed that the only right way to get land from Indians was to buy it. So like he ended up, I believe, purchasing Rhode Island, okay? But native land was sometimes bought through purchase, like these depopulated Native Americans that had lost all their land from epidemics. They were willing to sell the land that they weren't using. Sometimes it was just taken. There was like open fields that the Indians had died or left. And then oftentimes there are regional wars, okay? Native Americans and the New Englanders do get into conflicts. They do fight. And over time, the New Englanders start to win more and more of those fights, and they end up taking land. Like we talked about kidnapping, okay? There's stories of New Englanders being kidnapped by the Iroquois and other groups of Indians, and the New Englanders then get revenge by attacking the Indians which then kills Indians, takes their land, and stuff moves on. Okay, and sometimes the fights are started by the English, sometimes they're started by the natives, but over time, New England starts to grow at the expense of the Indians. Now, there is one major conflict in 1660 that really settles the question over who's in charge, the English or the Native Americans, okay? By the 1660s, the kind of friendly relationships, or relatively friendly, not necessarily friendly, but more friendly than the Virginia Indian relationships, had become a relationship of subordination and suspicion. The Puritans were more and more dominating of the Indians, and there was a lot of suspicion on both sides that there was about to be one big fight. And that actually did come, right? Metacom was the leader of a group of Native Americans called the Massasauga, okay? Metacom was called by the English as King Philip. The English called him King Philip, so the war that they have is called King Philip's War. Today, people try to call it Metacom's War, but at the time, English people called it King Philip. But anyways, King Philip, that's his English name. Metacom is his Native American name. He was convinced that if he did not act, over time, there would be more and more English. There would be no way that they would ever be able to win. So he says, if we're going to get rid of these English, we got to do it now. So he leads a strike against the English, and he ends up leading a long and deadly war in 1675. All right. In 1675 and 1676, Metacom's forces destroy more than 24 colonial towns. They lay waste to Plymouth Colony. They just destroy huge chunks of Puritan land. Now, this war really ruins what was left of friendship. There were some friendships between the English and the Native Americans, and there are even some people who believed that they were not supposed to steal land. Now, there are some people who believe that God had given them the right to all that land the Native Americans had. And there were a lot of English that wanted to see the Native Americans be converted to Puritan Christianity. And there were some Native Americans that converted to the Puritans and their Christian worship, but they were not as successful at converting people as the French were. Okay, but anyways, King Philip's first stage of the war makes most of the English people say, okay, we're done with Indians. All right, which is kind of ironic because the English had been pressuring them and taking their land for many, many years. But now the Indians are all bad, according to the English, and they retaliate in its full-scale war. Metacom is defeated in a battle in 1676. Okay, colonial forces dismember his body and brought his severed head to Boston and his hands to Plymouth as trophies. The Indian offensive collapsed, but they end up being defeated. They get pushed back, and the New Englanders, the English colonists, take basically everything back, and this breaks what was left of Indian resistance. But interesting thing, this war was absolutely devastating to the English. The Indians got very close to winning. And if you look at the proportion of casualties to population, so the number of people that died versus the number of people in the country, this was twice as deadly as the American Civil War, okay? So this is one of the deadliest conflicts in American history. This war killed more English people as a proportion to the total population of New England, twice as many as the proportion of the American Civil War. Okay, so this was not something to sneeze at. This was a serious and major conflict. Here's a blurry picture of Metacom. Okay, all right. Now let's move on real quickly. We're going to talk about the other colonies. But after this, after Metacom's war, New England is very solidly under the control of the English, and it continues to grow and follow along the patterns that we discussed earlier. Okay, now we're going to talk real quick about New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, and we're going to try to get this done in just a few minutes. So, New York, okay, and so we talked before that the Dutch had Fort Orange in New Amsterdam in New York. Well, in 1664, the English said, that's ours now, okay? The English invade New Netherlands. The Dutch people, they just surrender. They're like, we're not going to fight this, okay? we're way far away from Amsterdam. There's a lot of English people around us. We're just going to surrender. And so instead of killing all the Dutch people end up staying there. And New York becomes a diverse colony. Massachusetts, it's like all English people. Virginia, it's like English people, Indians, and African slaves. But New York is very diverse, okay? There's some people from England. There's some people from the Netherlands. There's even people, I believe there's like a group. There's Portuguese, Dutch, Belgians, French, Finns, Africans, some enslaved, some free Africans. And so this ethnic diversity meant that there was a variety of religions, okay? New York lets just everybody, there's no way they could enforce a standard religion if they wanted to, okay? It makes New York difficult to govern because there's all these different little groups, okay? But New York ends up growing and prospering. By 1698, the colony numbered only 18,000 inhabitants, okay? It was not massive and big, but New York starts to grow because it's in a very strategic place. It's at the mouth of the Hudson River, which becomes a trading hub later on. And so New York starts small, but it grows and grows and grows, okay? Now, New Jersey was founded in 1702 as a royal colony, okay? And New Jersey, there's not anything super crazy about New Jersey. But they do allow people to settle land. They have religious freedom, and they have a representative assembly. People who live in New Jersey have to pay a little bit of a fee, but New Jersey ends up getting split in half due to some complications about who owns what and where. Okay, and it ends up being just dominated by small farms and diverse ethnic and religious groups. All right, so you can read more about New Jersey. We're going to move on to Pennsylvania. Okay, so we've talked about lots of different religious groups. We talked about the Anglicans, we talked about Catholics, we talked about the Puritans and the Baptists and all these different people. One more flavor, okay, the Quakers. Quakers are kind of different, okay? They are Protestant Christians, but they are, I don't know, like, they're not like hippies or whatever, but they do believe that everyone is equal, and they believe that everyone has this internal light within them guiding them to make good decisions, okay? So they're not like the hardworking, orderly, stiff, conservative Puritans. They're not like the Catholics with their large rituals and very hierarchical beliefs with priests and bishops and archbishops and cardinals and the Pope at the top, okay? The Quakers are full on, everybody is equal, and they don't like to bow. They don't like to say sir, okay? They are oddballs, okay? In this time period, okay? Where in England, you've got like kings and knights and nobles, and you're supposed to bow down and say sir, that sort of thing. The Quakers are different, okay? Now, the Quakers, they are very plain. They don't like to bow, kneel, or remove their hats. They also refuse to swear oaths or make war. Very different from other groups. They are very okay with women being leaders, okay? They believe everybody's equal. It doesn't matter who you are, if you're a man or a woman. They allow women to be leaders in their churches, okay? And they believe that all men and women share equally in the light within, okay? There's about 40,000 English people, merchants, artisans, and farmers that are Quakers in 1660, and the Quakers are oppressed, okay? So like a lot of them get thrown in jail because they're Quakers. A lot of them get, tortured, okay? Like corporal punishment, imprisonment, fines because of their beliefs. The most famous Quaker is this guy named William Penn, okay? William Penn, he was going to join the Navy, or his father was in the Navy. He had like a bright start, but he kind of was like, Dad, I don't want to go and join the Navy. I want to be a Quaker and start churches. And so he kind of disappointed his father. But William Penn, he ends up being actually a very successful Quaker. He gives up a life of being, you know, because his dad was like an admiral. He had this like whole life plotted out for his son. Like, son, you're going to go to college. You're going to be an admiral. Everything's going to be great. And then, you know, he was like, no, Dad, you can't tell me what to do. I'm going to go start a church. I'm going to be a Quaker. And, you know, his dad was probably very disappointed in him. But he was probably more famous in history because of this than he would have been as an admiral. I mean, we wouldn't even talk about William Penn's dad probably if it wasn't for what William Penn does. Anyways, so William Penn was very eccentric, okay, as a Quaker. And interestingly enough, while most garden variety Quakers were imprisoned and punished, William Penn was able to make friends with the king, okay? And King Charles II actually really liked William Penn, maybe because he just thought he was an oddball and he thought he was funny and was like, hey, let's make fun of William Penn. But William Penn like made friends with Charles II, and the King, Charles II, gave William Penn the permission to settle land in 1681, all the land between New Jersey and Maryland, okay? Now, partially, this might have been a result of the fact that William Penn's dad had given the king, and his family had given the king a lot of money, okay, over time. Or maybe this was the king saying, if I let the Quakers all move to Pennsylvania, they'll leave, you know. And that was kind of how America was for England. It's like, we got some weird people. Let's just throw them over into America so we don't have to deal with them in England anymore. So 1681, William Penn establishes Pennsylvania. Now, as a Quaker, he does not force anyone to take up any religion. He gives freedom of religion to the people in Pennsylvania. And a lot of people start moving to Pennsylvania. He does a lot of pamphlets. He starts advertising, and he advertises heavily Pennsylvania. And by this point, by 1700, a lot of people are interested in America. There's lots of successful colonies. It's not like it was in the Roanoke days where this was like going to the moon and you may not come back ever. Now it's like lots of people live in America. Let's go, okay? By 1700, 21,000 people had moved to Pennsylvania. The only other colony that's like close to this is New England, which was a little bit faster in its growth, pretty much. But lots of people moved to Pennsylvania. About half of the people who moved to Pennsylvania are indentured servants, but there's a lot of small farmers and artisans. The majority of people were Quakers, but there were other non-Quakers, okay, Baptists, Anglicans, Lutherans, Catholics, Presbyterians. They were all welcome, okay? Now, William Penn was different from other colonizers because he was very determined by his Quaker beliefs. He was not going to go and fight Indians and take their land. So he peacefully negotiated and purchased land from the Indians. And there was a very odd, unique peace between the settlers and the Indians of the area called the Lenni Lenapes, okay? And in fact, they made quite a bit of friends, and they learned each other's languages, and things were going pretty well. But here's the thing. William Penn, like a lot of these early colonies, there's like one guy, like you might think about Sir Walter Raleigh or the Calverts or, you know, what's his name, Coods in Georgia. There's all these colonies where like one person starts it and they're like, this is my chance to be a king. And everybody's going to live in my colony, pay me taxes every year. One thing you'll learn in American history, we don't like taxes, okay? So the people in Pennsylvania were supposed to like pay taxes to William Penn. William Penn creates this legislative assembly and a council, and there's almost immediately tension between them. See, Penn wants to be friendly with the Indians. Farmers and other people, they want to be aggressive and take the land so they can expand their farms. Penn wants to ensure religious freedom. He wants people to pay him taxes. And a lot of the people in Pennsylvania don't like his ideas, okay? Philadelphia becomes the commercial and cultural center of England's North American empire. The interior of Pennsylvania gets filled with immigrants, a lot of Germans and Scotch-Irish. And as more and more of these Germans and Scotch-Irish move out into like the frontier, they're much more aggressive with the Native Americans than like the Quakers were around Philadelphia area. And so we start to see some conflicts, okay? Now, William Penn eventually gets kind of stripped of his power in the Charter of 1701, which creates the a revision to the frame of government. We're not going to get into all the dirty details, but essentially William Penn like starts the colony, gets it all set up, but then it grows beyond his control. The people of Pennsylvania don't like all of his ideas. Like, we like, Pennsylvania, we like the religious freedom, but we want to go fight the Indians and take land. And they had some disagreements about taxes and about individual specific rules that we're not going to get into. But Penn ends up compromising with them. He revises the frame of government. The Charter of Privileges sets up the assembly, and Pennsylvania gets, I think, the only single house legislature in the colonies at that point, instead of a two-house legislature. And William Penn ends up leaving. Anyways, it doesn't talk about this, but William Penn ends up, after he kind of loses control of his colony, he goes back to England, and then he ended up actually being defrauded by some of his more unscrupulous agents in his colony. He ends up going to prison for debt, and he dies in 1718 as a poor debtor. So William Penn is kind of a weird guy. He has this planned out future for him. He says no, becomes a religious leader. He becomes a leader of a massive colony, and then he ends up a debtor at the end of his life. So kind of rags to riches to riches to rags to riches to rags. There you go. So take that for what you will. There's a lot of weird stuff that happened in the origins of the Americas, and there's all these like crazy stories that happen, but it's kind of because everything's new. Everybody's doing things, and there's not a manual for how to start a colony, and there's not a manual for dealing with all these things. And so different people tackle the problem differently. And so each colony has its own unique history that I think is really interesting. I wish we had more time to go over everything, but you can go out and research this on your own, and you might find an interesting topic for your research paper. Anyways, we're going to finish up with kind of how everything changes, okay, how things stabilize. Over time, the empire takes more control over North America. From 1686 to 1688, the crown starts combining all the colonies of northeastern America into one entity in order to consolidate economic benefit for the home country. The crown actually tried to smash all the colonies together into New England. But then there is a massive fight in England called the Glorious Revolution. Okay, so this is another, it's kind of like what happened when Oliver Cromwell took over England and created the Republic. Like, people were worried that he was going to ruin everything and, change all the rules, but then he died and then things went back to normal. People in the Americas just kind of wait and see, okay, so you're changing all the rules. We're just going to hang out and see what happens. And a couple of years later, things did change. King James II is deposed in favor of his Protestant daughter Mary and her Dutch husband William of Orange. This is called the Glorious Revolution, and William and Mary dismember the Dominion of New England. So the colonies get to stay separate. Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, they aren't all squished together. They remain separate, and they're like, hey, sometimes the solution to a problem is just wait. This looks like a problem. Let's just wait and see if it solves itself. And it did, okay? By 1700, there is more and more royal authority in America, okay? William and Mary were more politic than James II, but they're still interested in revenue. So there starts to be more and more closer regulation of trade. And one by one, all those individual colonies and their charters and companies, they start to be standardized, and each colony gets a royal government. The way the royal governments work is the crown appoints a governor to rule the colony, but each colony has its own legislative assembly that kind of takes care of most of the business, but the crown does have a say. And so technically the assemblies are just advising the colony's governor, but most of the time in practice, the colony's governor goes along with the legislature, which is what later leads to a lot of what happens in the Revolution. Because leading up to the Revolution, the colonial governors start ignoring the assemblies and start dismantling them so that they could have more supreme authority over New England. But during this time leading up from 1700 to 1776, the representative assemblies become more and more formalized. And instead of just like in early Massachusetts, it was just the guys at the church just said, okay, what's our laws going to be? Let's vote on it. By the time we get to 1700, we have formal assemblies. There are people that are lawyers, there are doctors, there are skilled artisans. People are more than just like independent, tiny little farmers, but they've developed a very complex society that is very similar to the society in England. And the representative assemblies are very skilled and educated and able to articulate political ideals, and they start protecting their rights and their ability to govern and have authority over their territories. So that kind of leads us to the point where we are going to wrap up for today. Okay, you can see that New England is very different from Virginia and the southern colonies. They ended up becoming more closely representative of England itself, and you start to see some of the things that lead to the Revolution. You see the beginning of a different identity. Each colony kind of has its own history. It has its own leaders. They have their own assemblies, and they get used to the idea of governing themselves, making their own laws and making their own rules, which will become very important in the future. So with that in mind, we're going to stop for today. Please make sure that you're continuing to do your homework. I sent all of you guys a test review. If you have any questions, please email me. Let me know if you have any questions. And I hope to see you all very, very soon.